Okay, in this presentation, we're going to talk about the value of a worldview, and the title is What in the World is a Worldview and Where Can I Get One? This presentation was discussed at our apologetics meeting at the Ohio State University earlier this year. So it is my hope and prayer that when you're done with this, you will understand the importance of having a worldview. Now, there have been hundreds of books written about the worldview topic. I just want to highlight some of them if you want to go deeper on this. James Sire book here on the far left is one of the most well-known books. This is the 5th edition, called The Universe Next Door. The book called Hidden Worldviews is an excellent resource as well. We also have an introduction to Christian worldview. The third book here in the middle, that came out recently, and that's a very good resource. And then David Nagel's book, Worldview, The History of Concept, came out a ways back, but that is an excellent resource that traces the history of the worldview thinking and worldview in light of what Christian scholars have said about it and other scholars have taught about it over the decades before us. Another book that's really good is called A World of Difference by Kenneth Samples. And then these books by Summit Ministries called Understanding the Times. They have a bunch of books, but this is one of the best ones, Understanding the Times, a survey of competing worldviews. Christian Contours here, and then Why You Think the Way You Do is another book. So you can see there's more than enough resources out there if you want to go deeper on this topic, and I hope you will by the time you're done with this. So we need to ask ourselves, when we tell someone about the gospel, the good news, is the goal of our faith simply about saving souls? Is it about getting someone to believe in Jesus so when they leave this world, they will be in heaven when they die? That is how many people perceive the biblical worldview, and that is how many people perceive Christians. And we need to ask ourselves, is that all our faith is? Is simply about the afterlife? Is it about only having a personal relationship with God? And so I'm hoping that by the end of this presentation, you will see that our faith is much more than that. And not that this is irrelevant, but it is much larger, much broader than simply the afterlife. So let's do a quick definition here of a worldview. James Sire says our worldview is a set of the presuppositions about the basic makeup of our world, or a worldview or vision of life is a framework or a set of fundamental beliefs through which we view the world and our calling and future in it. So that's one general definition. There's been many definitions other than these, but that's a pretty good starting point. We could say another definition is right here in another book called Making Sense of Your World by Gary Phillips, William Brown, and John Stonestreet. Says here an explanation, or worldview is an explanation, interpretation of the world, and second, an application of this view. We might just want to say a worldview is the way we view reality. It's the way we see the world around us and how we apply our worldview into our life. It's not only what we believe, it has an application as well into the everyday living of our lives. So those are just a couple general definitions. And as I say right here, while the worldview is the glasses through which we see reality, we need to remember that when you develop a worldview, the worldview that you hold is not just an intellectual, rational construct. Sometimes when I've taught on worldviews or I've studied worldviews or people think about worldviews, they simply think that it may just be about an intellectual system. That is not the case. Not only is there a rational component to developing a worldview is something that also takes root within us. It takes root in our hearts, and then it should flow out of our hearts into what we think and say and do. So we don't want to limit it just to being an intellectual system of some kind. It's much broader than that. Now, whatever worldview we are forming, whatever worldview we have, we begin to see that a worldview is very important, because whatever our worldview is, that'll impact how we raise our family. It'll impact how we have relationships with peers and friends. It'll impact our education. It'll impact everything. It impacts all these areas, but these things that I list here also are what form our worldview. There's no doubt that family can play an integral role in forming your worldview. There's no doubt that peers and friends play a role in forming your worldview. Of course, your education plays a huge role. Religious influences can play a role. And then social media, as we see today, is playing a tremendous role in how people form their worldview. So a worldview can be impacted by many things, but these are some of the components out there that people are using, or these are the things that are influencing how they're forming their worldview. There's no doubt that a worldview is very important because it impacts the choices you make. It'll impact how you raise your family. It'll impact how you vote, and it certainly impacts how you spend your time and money. So for those that say a worldview is irrelevant and we just need to teach people to get people saved so they can go to heaven when they die, have a very, very limited view of what the Bible teaches. So a worldview is extremely important because there's no doubt that ideas have consequences. So different worldviews have been played out in the history of mankind, and we know some of those worldviews have led to destruction. And we need to be aware of those other worldviews around us, because just like it was a long time ago, it's still the same thing today, that ideas do have consequences, as Richard Weaver said in his book here a long time ago. We need to also remember worldview's power over us is magnified when we are not conscious of its influence. So we need to keep important worldview questions inside to keep from getting sidetracked. Remember that one of the most important questions in any worldview is who gets to be God, because the God question will always play a role in somebody's worldview. So that's why we cannot ignore the God question thinking about a worldview. Now, some people say, when I've taught on worldviews or taught about the importance of having a worldview, they may say to me, well, you know what? Some people just aren't that deep. They aren't that reflective. They don't think about these issues. They just live their lives. They don't slow down, think about their worldview. So who cares about this? Well, that's just unfortunate, because we don't really go by the dictates of the culture. We're called to be image bearers of God and called to be disciples of Jesus. And so just because nobody else seems to be caring about worldview issues doesn't mean we need to follow their leading. We follow God's leading, of course, what the Bible teaches and what Jesus taught, which is to love the Lord your God with all our heart and soul and mind. And we need to have a worldview. Now, we also need to remember that there's no doubt that there is a huge competition between the American dream and the good news today, the good news being the gospel and the American dream. And many people get these mixed up because we're so encouraged to pursue the American dream. And it's not that everything about the American dream is bad, but remember, as I say here, number one, the American dream generally starts with yourself. It exalts yourself. It says you are inherently good and that you have in you what it takes to be successful. If we contrast that with the good news, the gospel, the good news begins with God and that we are not inherently good, and everything is not about our own lives, but the life of Messiah, the life of Jesus. And it's not always about me making much of myself. It's about me making much of God. So when God's on the throne of our lives and we are disciples of Jesus, we have to remember the whole story of this world doesn't start with us. It's God's world and it's God's story. We get to participate in it. And that plays a huge part of how we form our worldview. Now, remember also that when people ignore worldview questions, that a quote like this is very important, because look what he says here, this quote right here, the author, he says, because people are having real and helpful spiritual experiences in certain areas of their lives, such as worship, prayer, Bible studies, and fellowship, they mistakenly believe they are doing fine, even if their relational life and interior world is not in order. This apparent progress then provides a spiritual reason for not doing the hard work of maturing. They are deceived. So basically, the author is saying that we can't afford to just simply think that our Christian life is about having emotional experiences with God. We have to have a deeper interior world. We need to also develop our worldview. It's not that having experiences with God is a bad thing. It's just that we need to realize that we need to have a holistic worldview, or a holistic faith, which includes having a worldview. We need to incorporate that into our discipleship. And as I said right here, I'll repeat it again. Remember, we are disciples of Jesus. Jesus calls us to love God with all our being, all our mind, our soul and strength. And of course, heart in the Bible is the totality of who you are. And so when it comes to loving God with all our being, that includes having a worldview. We can't ignore that issue. Now, there's no doubt that there are some trends out there that contribute to a spirit of anti-intellectualism. And as I said before, sometimes a worldview is viewed as being part of just like some sort of intellectual system. And some people say, the heck with that. That's not what Christianity is about, or that's not what my faith is about. And they think that developing a worldview or teaching others about worldview is unnecessary. And this comes from a spirit of anti-intellectualism that's been around a long time. And these are some of the things that play into that anti-intellectualism. There's no doubt that many Christians are pragmatic, as you see here. Pragmatism, that means if something works, it is true. If something doesn't work, you try something else that works in your life. You're just interested in getting the end result. You're not so much caring about whether it even could be true. It's more or less just get it done and let's get the best result we can. And so many people think very pragmatically. Therefore, they don't think so much about whether their belief is actually based in reality, because they're so focused on results. As I say in the middle paragraph here, many people are impatient. Some people become very bored. They have this focus on just doing it and getting it done. So they don't think very clearly, or they don't think hard about their worldview. They don't think about whether their worldview is coherent or whether it is actually based in reality. Sometimes they just get it done and they don't think through it. Of course, there's also preoccupation with feelings, as I say here. We have a very feeling generation. The feeling sometimes triumphs over reason in our decision making. If it feels good, do it, is often a principle that people use for behavior. So these are some of the things that contribute to a spirit of anti-intellectualism in the culture and also in the church as well. So we don't want to fall into that trap here. We don't want to follow the lead of the culture. And obviously, as I said before, many people aren't that reflective because they're simply trying to live the American dream, which of course is get a job, make money, retire, and die. So sometimes some people say, well, I just don't have time to think about a worldview. But we as followers of Jesus cannot follow the culture's lead. We are called to have a worldview and to develop our worldview over the course of our discipleship. So let's talk about some of the worldview questions that are out there. One of the biggest questions of a worldview is the issue of origins. And of course, there's an ongoing debate about this. It's gone on for several decades, and many people are still debating whether we are simply further evolved animals that came about through the interplay of matter, time, and chance, or are we created in the image and likeness of a personal God? Now, I'm not going to go into the different debates about this right now. I can talk a little bit about it, but this is certainly a very important worldview question, where we come from. We can't ignore this question. So this plays a role in all the other worldview questions as well. Because look at this quote right here. You need to ask yourself, are you an accident of nature? Look at this quote in this book, Chance and Necessity. The author says, man is alone in the universe's unfeeling immensity, out of which he emerged by chance. Chance alone is at the source of every innovation of all creation, the biosphere. Pure chance, absolutely free but blind, is at the very root of stupendous edifice of evolution. So we may want to ask ourselves, if nature made us, what made nature? If we're only the result of time and chance and nature, then perhaps we need to ask, where did nature come from? That's a big topic for another time. And of course, there are things out there where we could look at things like the beginning of the universe. We talk about this issue with like a life permitting universe and the chances of life coming from non-life, and the issue of how we even get to biological evolution. Now, these issues are debated, and many people have calculated the odds using probability theory of these things happening without an agent involved or any kind of intelligence. But there's an ongoing debate about this issue. Plays a role in the worldview question of origins, where we came from. And there's no doubt many creation models within Christian circles that are debated. I'm not going to go into all of these, but the point is that all of these I have on this chart right here are some form of a creationist model. So when someone says, are you a creationist, you need to ask what you mean by creationist, because there's so many different models out there. Even theistic evolution is appealing to a creator. The only one that would be totally incompatible with biblical faith here would definitely be theistic evolution. While theistic evolution is very debated right now, I'm not saying I agree with everything about theistic evolution. It still invokes a creator. So these are some of the models that are debated within Christian circles. And we always need to ask people when they say whether you believe in evolution or creation, you always want to get them to define what they mean by evolution, because there's different definitions of evolution. These are some of the definitions right here. Uh, Definition number one, evolution can mean change over time, history of nature, any sequence of events in nature. There's no problem with that. Or changes in the frequencies in the gene pool of a population. There's not a lot of controversy about that. Or limited common descent, the idea that a particular group of organisms descended from a common ancestor. That's still somewhat debated in some areas. There's still obviously ongoing research and ongoing debate in that area. And of course, when you get down to number 4 and 5 and 6, those things are heavily debated. And so we want to just make sure that we're defining what we mean by evolution. So that plays a big role in the whole discussion. What do you mean by creation, or what do you mean by creationist, and what do you mean by evolution? Long topic indeed. And another worldview question is, what is the nature of humanity? Is humanity simply a highly complex meat machine, or a person made in the image of God? Are we created in the image and likeness of a personal God? So this is a good book to read about consciousness by J.P. Moreland, which shows that we are much more than simply a meat machine. There's other arguments out there as well to show that, but this is a good starting point if you want to get into that debate. And then, of course, another worldview question that is a huge worldview question is the issue of morality. Is God the foundation of objective moral values and moral duties, or do humans or society alone create their own moral values and moral duties? That is an ongoing debate as well, but that's a very important question. Another worldview question is, when we look at the world, what exactly is wrong with the world? What does a better world look like? And who gets to define what a better world does look like? Many, many people spend all their lives fighting for a better world and fighting for human rights and human dignity and human equality because they think the world should be a better place to live in. But once again, we're back to the issue is who gets to define what a better world is? Is there any kind of objective standard to go off of? And of course, what is wrong with the world to begin with, and why are there things that are wrong with the world? What is the cause of the problems in the world? Another worldview question is, what's wrong with humans? As I just said, does your worldview explain why humans are able to commit horrible atrocities, or why they're able to do the opposite? Humans are obviously capable of doing some of the most amazing things and helping mankind, but other times doing the complete opposite. So we need to ask what worldview will answer that question as well. Another worldview question is, what is reality? Some people believe the physical material world is all there is. They don't believe there's anything that transcends the physical world. That's an ongoing debate as well. There's arguments on both sides, but the point is that this definitely is a huge worldview question. What is reality? Another worldview question that's very relevant to today's world is identity, and that is the issue of what defines us. Are we identified as being an image bearer of God, or being a child of God, and are we fulfilling our calling there, or is our identity in something else? Are we grabbing all of our identity and all our attention and taking something else, such as where we live, our career, our sexuality, our political positions? Are we taking those things and forming our identity around those things? Are those things defining us? So this is a huge worldview question today. For example, take identity politics, which is very, very popular today. As this author says right here in the book, The Once and Future Liberal, he says politics has become a primary forum in which we seek meaning. We go to politics to express our identity and have our identity affirmed. So the question is, why do people find their identity in politics today? Is it because they need a purpose? Is it because they think politics can fix all the problems of the nation or the world? We need to ask ourselves why there's so much identity politics today. That's a very good talking point. For example, Kirsten Powers, she used to be a former Democratic strategist. She came to know Christ, and she is now a devout Christian. Came from atheism to Christianity. She said that democratic politics had at one extent been her core identity, that was her religion. As she says here, I think my whole world life it's centered on democratic politics. She told this to Howard Kurtz. She said, I was very much in that bubble. I worked in the Clinton administration, so I had all these friends from there. And then into democratic politics in New York, so that's what we sort of bonded over. That was our religion to a certain extent. And that's true, because if you do not have a biblical worldview and you do not find your identity as image bearer of God, you are going to find your identity as something else. There's many people around us that have their identity in many things other than their relationship with God. So this is an example of how it played out in politics. Another worldview question is purpose. Is there any objective meaning and purpose in this world? Or are we simply random creatures in a purposeless, meaningless universe? Now, some people can create their own meaning and purpose. There's no doubt that people can get purpose and meaning in their careers and relationships and volunteer projects and all kinds of things. So the question is there any objective meaning in the world? Because people can have subjective meaning, no doubt, and they can create their own subjective purpose. The question is there actual any objective meaning and purpose? Is there any ultimate meaning and purpose in life? So this is a very important worldview question as well. Another worldview question is destiny. Where is the human race headed? What is our end? Is there an end goal of any kind? Is there any destination? Or is it just going to be a simple case of personal extinction where we just cease to exist, or we transform to higher state, such as reincarnation, or are we resurrected one day? Of course, this plays into what you believe about resurrection in the Bible and afterlife questions, history, and things like that. But this is an important worldview question. So here's an interesting quote by a gentleman called E.O. Wilson. His name is E.O. Wilson, and he has a book called The Meaning of Human Existence. He says here, we were created not by supernatural intelligence, but by chance and necessity as one species out of millions of species in Earth's biosphere, hope and wish for otherwise as we will. There is no evidence of an external grace shining down upon us, no demonstrable destiny or purpose assigned to us, no second life for us for the end of the present one. And we are in many cases completely alone. And that, in my opinion, is a very good thing. It means we're completely free. So here we see somebody that seems to think they have a pretty strong case against the existence of God, and they've said basically there is no higher purpose. So that's an example of somebody that thinks it's a settled issue. He's very wrong, but that's someone that definitely comes out and says exactly what he believes, so we have to respect that. Now, these are worldview comparisons here. If you do believe in God and you believe in the biblical God, you're going to believe that the things on the right-hand side, the far right side, will answer these worldview questions, where if you're on the left-hand side, obviously, you do not think the biblical God exists. You can compare these 5 important worldview questions, such as our view of reality, origins, humans, morality, and authority. And you can see the sharp contrast here on both sides. So these are good worldview questions, and this is a good way to compare these questions and whether the biblical worldview answers these questions better than the secular, or maybe might want to say a naturalistic worldview or materialistic worldview. Here's another worldview that's popular called pantheistic monism. This is the view that many Hindus have and other people in Eastern religions. They believe their view of God is that all reality is an undifferentiated one, and that there is one God or ultimate reality. And of course, regarding the world question, the physical universe is apparently real or an actual illusion, or it somehow emanates from God, or is created out of God's being. Knowledge and reason and logic are an illusion and interfere with mystical enlightenment. Of course, they believe in karma. Ethics, there's certainly like a cause and effect that is operative in the universe. Regarding humans, the true human self is identical in essence to the ultimate reality or God. And then history has a cyclical view and a viewpoint. So this is a contrast to some of the Eastern religions, especially Hinduism, that's what they believe in some of these worldview questions. Now let's talk about worldview tests. Now this is very important. So how can we test a worldview? Well, we need to ask ourselves, is there a verification test? Can the worldview that you're embracing or looking at be verified or falsified? And that means how well does a worldview explain the facts of reality, and how wide is the range of its explanation, its scope? So these are a couple things we can ask when we're looking at a worldview. Is there a way it can be verified or falsified? And then does it really explain reality? And does it have a good explanation for reality? So we need to talk about truth, of course, because you're going to ask whether something is falsifiable or whether it can be verified. We need to remember the most important test for truth is whether truth is that which corresponds to reality, whether truth is that which matches its object. We live by the correspondence theory of truth every day of our lives. If I say that I'm going to the grocery store to buy groceries, that means I'm going to a real grocery store in reality down the street, and I'm going to buy the groceries. Of course, that can be verified by somebody. They can see me doing that. But the point is, I'm making a claim that I think matches reality. And these are the three big worldview tests. Correspondence is probably one of the most important tests in testing a worldview, and of course, testing any belief system. And the coherence test is another one. That means that there's like a web of beliefs. They all kind of cohere together. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on that. We've already talked about pragmatism. The truth, they believe truth is what benefits somebody, or truth is what works. That's how some people pick a worldview. They say it is a workable solution, or it provides solutions to problems. It has a good outcome to it. So remember that you could believe, the question is, can you believe something that's false even if it works? For example, Mormons and Muslims believe that their worldviews and their faith certainly makes a difference in their lives. It may work for them, but the question is, do those faiths correspond to reality? I don't believe the Book of Mormon has good evidence for it, and the Quran says Jesus never died, which goes against the weight of history. So I would say, even if those two worldviews or belief systems worked out in reality in a practical way, in a pragmatic way, that doesn't make them true by any means. Here's an example of an atheist that made a claim that doesn't match reality. Michael Shermer is a well-known atheist. He said here that modern science arose in the 16th and the 17th centuries following the scientific revolution, the adoption of scientific naturalism, the belief that the world is governed by natural laws and forces that are knowable, that all phenomena are part of nature and can be explained by natural causes, and the human cognitive, social, moral phenomena are no less a part of that comprehensible world. That claim does not match reality. That is a false view. We know the evidence is not behind what he just said, because we know there's been more than enough written now to show that it was theism rather than atheism that provided the intellectual foundation for the scientific revolution. Books like James Hannon's work here have shown that it was deists and theists that laid the groundwork for the modern scientific revolution. So Shermer is in error, and that is an example of somebody that's saying something that does not match reality. Same thing happens here with Alex Rosenberg's book, The Atheist Guide to Reality. He says in his books these 5 things here, like, for example, number 1, he says, is there a God? He says, no. What is the nature of reality? He says, what physics says it is. Number 3, what is the purpose of the universe? There is none. Number 4, what is the meaning of life? Ditto. Why am I here? Just dumb luck. Is there free will? Not a chance. What is the difference between right, wrong, good, and bad? He says there's no moral difference between them. So here's a bunch of questions about reality that Alex Rosenberg seems to think science can answer, and science can't answer some of these questions, so he's wrong. And of course, the evidence behind all these responses can go in the opposite direction. So that's an example where we look at these claims, we ask whether they can be verified or falsified, and that's where we apply truth tests to them, and we look at the evidence for these claims, whether they match up with reality or they don't. Now we get into the issue of God's existence, looking at whether there is a God. There's, as I've talked about before, there's different ways to approach the existence of God. We can talk about rational demonstration here. We can talk about design arguments. We can talk about historical arguments. We could talk about God being explanation to reality, using inference to best explanation. We can talk about intuition. We can talk about religious experience. We can talk about whether God explains worldview questions. But remember, as I say on the far right here, the last 3 points on the far right, God's existence isn't dependent on how you feel or whether you're happy. God can still exist whether or not you feel him or whether or not you're happy in your life or whether you're just busy or successful. That has no bearing on whether there's a God. So the bottom line question is we need to ask if it's really true. Does the claim that the God of the Bible exists match reality? Does that claim match reality? And as I said before about the pragmatic test, we could apply the pragmatic test to the history of Christianity or biblical theism. There's no doubt that people have done amazing things in the name of Christ. There's been a lot of things in the world around us that have been impacted by the biblical worldview. Some of these books here talk about this in greater detail. Of course, there are examples of people that have professed the name of Christ that have done terrible things. And of course, the pragmatic test would fail in some ways because people don't always live up to the standard that Jesus set for us. But that does not mean that Jesus did not exist, and it doesn't mean Jesus didn't rise from the dead. Jesus could still rise from the dead, even if his followers do not perfectly follow his teachings and reflect him in the culture around us. So that's why we need to always go back to the correspondence test before the pragmatic test, as I mentioned before. And as I said before, just with like Islam and Mormonism, even if something works, it doesn't mean it's always true, because we know that lies can work well for many people. You could believe something that isn't really based in reality and say it works in your life, but that doesn't mean it's true. There's also another test in looking at a worldview. They're called existential tests. This means that people have existential needs. Many people have the need for meaning, the need to feel loved, the need to love themselves, the need for justice and fairness, the need to be present with our loved ones. And these books right here have written about this. And I suggest you read them because existential tests are very important to people. They don't want just a rational system in their life. They want their existential desires to be met, their existential needs. So we could say that biblical theism answers these existential needs better than any other worldview, and that would possibly point to the existence of God, as Clifford Williams talks about here on the book on the side here, Existential Reasons for Belief in God. He thinks people have these needs, which means that God has created these needs in us, and he responds to criticisms of his view, but it's something that is worth looking at. Now, what about the issue of, can people change their worldview? Does that ever happen? Do people ever go through a worldview conversion? Well, yes, it does happen sometimes. Remember, though, the role of confirmation bias. There's no doubt that people do tend to only seek out information that confirms their existing beliefs. So that means it can be very hard for people to consider new evidence. It can be very hard for them to change their worldview because they're already so set in their beliefs and they're afraid that they could be wrong, so they don't want to look at any information that may counter what they already believe. Now, confirmation bias is something that is not only in religious beliefs, it's in atheism, it's in politics, it's in all kinds of things. So don't think that religious people are the only ones that have issues of confirmation bias. It crosses over into all kinds of fields. For example, this happened in the Michael Shermer-Gary Habermas debate called Is There Life After Death? And at one point during the debate, Habermas would cite near-death experience documented cases, many, multiple cases of near-death experiences, and Shermer responded by saying, well, people make stuff up all the time. He said he rejected the evidence that Habermas presented because the people that claim to have these near-death experiences are conspiring together to deceive others. So there's an example of somebody that was not willing to possibly change his worldview. And at one point, Shermer said during the debate, you cannot change an entire worldview based on an anomaly. Anomaly is something that's kind of like a freak accident or rare event. And so Habermas actually responded to Shermer by giving more evidential cases where patients experienced things that occurred at a distance from their physical and fully dead bodies, information that was physically impossible for them to have obtained, such as a red tennis shoe on the hospital roof or the substance of a family's dinner 5 miles away and others. So Habermas just cited more and more evidence, which Shermer just kind of didn't really accept at all. And that's an example of somebody that simply does not accept a different worldview because of confirmation bias. Now, Shermer isn't the only one guilty of this. Christians do the same thing too, but I just want to show you how powerful confirmation bias is. And so sometimes when we're challenged with things we hear that challenge our worldview, we have what's called cognitive dissonance. Everybody has this in many areas of their lives where you already believe something and then you hear something that provides an alternative view or challenges your view. It creates a feeling of discomfort. And you may say to yourself, well, I thought I knew this was the thing to believe, but now I'm hearing counter evidence. I'm experiencing this dissonance. And like I said, atheists have the problem, Christians have this problem. So everyone encounters some cognitive dissonance. It's just part of building our belief systems and examining them on a regular basis. Anthony Flew was somebody that changed his worldview. Anthony Flew, he was a well-known atheist and a well-known philosopher who later in life came to believe there was a God because of the evidence from cosmology and physics. So he did come out of his atheism, even though we don't think he ever became a Christian. But the point is that there are examples of people that do undergo worldview conversion. It just depends on the person, the circumstances. So this is an interesting book if you want to get it and check it out. Now, we should remember a few tips here, last few things. Here's some tips in picking a worldview. Remember that sometimes I run into difficult questions. Difficulty should not prompt quick rejection. Many times some people are impatient and they think like a worldview can't answer a question. They just already give up on it and move on. They don't spend the time and spend the hard work into asking those questions, dealing with difficult questions over and over and examining them. So that is not a reason to reject a certain worldview just because of difficulty or challenging questions. And remember, some people think that their worldview must give them certitude. Remember, when we say certitude, as Mortimer Adler talked about here, he says here, number one, a worldview can't be challenged in light of additional, more acute observations, or two, it can't be criticized on the basis of more cognate or more comprehensive reasoning. So basically, he's defining what certitude is here. Certitude is when you arrive to something that cannot be challenged by anything. It is indubitable beyond doubt. There's no possible future evidence that could come in that could change your worldview. You have such certitude that no new evidence could ever be presented that would change it. Now, I think it's obvious that many of us don't have that level of certitude. Many of us don't get that in our worldview. It's very hard to get in anything except maybe mathematics and logic. So some people reject a worldview because they can't attain certitude, but that's not necessary. We don't attain certitude in practically everything in life. Another worldview issue is sometimes the unexplained is not necessarily unexplainable. That means that just because there's some things that are hard to understand in a worldview, such as mysteries or things that may never be answered thoroughly, we don't want to just reject the worldview. Every worldview you can examine out there will never answer every question exhaustively. There will always be some mysteries. There will always be some unanswered questions. So don't reject the worldview just because some things aren't perfectly explainable. And these are a few of the competing worldviews today. As I wrap up here, there's no doubt that materialism is still out there. That means that some people believe the only thing that matters in life is acquiring things because they think in the end the one with the most toys wins. But that's not true because the one in the end with the most toys dies as well. So they don't win because they don't take any of that stuff with them. They die just like anybody else. Another worldview is individualism, me first, whatever the goal. The goal in life is to be happy, of course, and the whole goal is to just make decisions that make you happy. It's all about you. Of course, this feeds into number 3 with the hedonism and emotionalism. A lot of people just do what feels good. They pursue the things that make them feel good. The purpose of life is just to have fun. And then, of course, pragmatism, as I said, is very popular these days. Whatever works is true, different strokes for different folks. And so these are just a few of the competing worldviews that are out there. There's many more you can get in those books I recommended at the beginning. So that about concludes our presentation here. I hope this has gotten you thinking about the importance of having a worldview and some of the worldview questions that you can use with other people, because really the disagreements we have with people today about whether it be a social issue or political issue or spiritual issue really goes back to the worldview question. So I hope you can take this material and use it in your life, and I hope it helps you in your conversations with others. Have a good day.